Hello, my learned friends. What better time than during a constitutional crisis between the executive and the legislative branch to take a look at some stuff about government. And specifically in this lecture, we're going to take a look at what it means to be in contempt of Congress. Where does that come from? What's going on? What's going to happen next? And of course, we're referring to William Barr, the Attorney General, not handing over to a committee in the House after a subpoena the unretracted Bob Mueller report. President Trump has claimed executive privilege, and the House of Representatives is like, what you talking about? You're not honoring the subpoena. So that's what we're going to do in this lecture. We're going to do it right now. We're going to do it old-fashioned style. We're going to do it with some giddy up for the learning, and we're going to get her done right now. So if you open up the Constitution and you look at Article 1, you'll find all kinds of things that the Congress can do, including oversight of the executive branch, and specifically in the House of Representatives. Now, there is no word contempt or contempt of Congress in the actual Constitution, but early on, Congress kind of invented it as an implied power to do their job to enforce the things that they wanted to enforce. Early on, it was done when officials were caught bribing people, and they would drag them in front of Congress, they would find them in contempt, and they would take care of business. But in the modern era, it's really been dealing with subpoenas. A subpoena is something that Congress, the House, or the Senate issues somebody to compel them to come to testify or to hand over very important papers like the unretracted Bob Mueller report. Now, in 1821, the Supreme Court looks at this power of the contempt of Congress, and they decide in a case called Anderson versus Dunn that, Congress has this implied power. They need to be able to do their job to, do it faithfully, to be able to do oversight. They can have this procedure called contempt of Congress. In 1857, Congress takes even a further step by passing a law signed by the president, which makes contempt of Congress a criminal offense punishable by up to $100,000 and up to 1 year in jail. But as we've mentioned earlier, we're really dealing with subpoenas. Once the subpoena is issued and somebody says, I'm not going to do it, what is the next step that Congress is going to be able to take? Now, in terms of what makes a legitimate subpoena, the House and the Senate really have pretty free reign. In the early 60s, there was a case called Wilkinson versus the United States, where basically they set a three-prong rule out for subpoenas, saying that it has to be an authorized investigation. They have to have some type of purpose for the investigation that relates to oversight or legislative purpose, and the actual thing that they're subpoenaing, is that a word? Has to actually be related to that investigation. But other than that, it's kind of like laissez-faire. The judicial branch really is, honoring separation of powers, allowing the House and the Senate to decide what they want to subpoena and allow them to do their job. So now that William Barr has been found to be in contempt of Congress, what are the choices that lay in front of Nancy Pelosi? What shall she do? Let's take a look at the three choices right now. Statutory. It is a crime. It's a crime to be in contempt of Congress. Now, this would make much more sense if the same party operated the executive branch, but Nancy could refer it for prosecution to the Department of Justice. Of course, if she did that, she'd be referring it to the U.S. Attorney Federal in Washington, D.C. And you know who his boss is? I'll give you a hint. It's William Barr. Chances are they're probably not going to prosecute him. So that kind of takes that option off the table. And Congress can't compel, the court has found, the Justice Department to do a prosecution because that's separation of powers. Now, there are some constitutional scholars that argue this is actually an impeachable offense by the president because they're not faithfully executing the law. Because it's their job to faithfully execute the law, not interpret it. And if the law says that it's a crime and somebody committed it, and you're getting in the way of that investigation, you're impeding that, that you're violating your oath to the Constitution. But that's probably not going to happen. So we probably can take option one, referring for prosecution, off the table. Choice two, the slow roll. They could just go through the federal court system. They could, go to the federal court and say they're not honoring their subpoena, and it would work itself through the district courts, the federal courts, up to the Supreme Court. And usually that takes such a long time, it could take years, that usually there's some kind of compromise that's hatched out in the meantime. But that is one option. They could go through the courts, but if they're looking for instant relief, that's probably not going to be very satisfying. Choice 3, inherent contempt, the most gangster of all of the choices. Now, because they're violating congressional rules, the contempt citation, the House and the Senate, they have kind of like a little mini enforcement agency. They have a sergeant of arms, and they have done this in the past. It hasn't been done since 1934, but they could order the detainment of that individual. So the sergeant of arms would arrest the attorney general. Now, there is a statutory process for how this occurs, but they would basically be brought in front of the House because that's where the contempt happened, and there would be like a mini trial where he'd be able to defend himself. There's certain kind of rules that don't apply, like number one, no pardons apply because it's not a crime against the United States per se, and also there's no attorney-client privileges, but they'd have a little mini trial. Now, the catch is that they could sentence them to prison, but only for the length of that congressional term, and then that would end. But that is a choice. If the Democrats really want to grow some fangs and they want to fight back for what they might see as the loss of their constitutional power, that is in the arsenal. That would be pretty whack. So we hope your brain is a little bit bigger, that you understand what it means to be found in contempt of Congress, the constitutionality of all, and what options lay in front of the House or the Senate when that occurs. So I think we're going to have to end it right now, but not before we ask you to leave some comments down below. What do you think should be done? Who do you think is in the right? Is it a constitutional crisis, or am I just inflating this so I can get more hits on a video? I don't know. But what I do know is that I say the same thing at the end of every video that I've ever done, so I can say it right now, because I mean it with all my heart. Where attention goes, my friends, energy flows. We'll see you next time. Press my buttons.